young woman who had become Queen of England at 18 had matured into a proud and sometimes priggish wife and mother. She and Prince Albert believed in what would become known as Victorian values. In particular, the sanctity of home and family and the supremacy of the Protestant religion. They were values shared by most of Victoria's British subjects, rich or poor. Despite the squalor and poverty of their own cities, the Victorians began to see themselves as God's chosen people, with a mission to spread the gospel to other lands.
All of these things come together around this period, around sort of 1815 onwards, to develop a very new attitude within Britain, a feeling that they are the face of the future, really, and a desire to now to impose this on others. They feel they have a duty to do this, to civilize people, and this is known as the civilizing mission. And from this date onwards, really, there is a great change in the attitude of the British to the Indian people.
This feeling coincided with new inventions and initiatives that would bring the two worlds of England and India closer together, with horrific results for both. In the days before the Suez Canal, the passage from England to India was round the southern tip of Africa, a journey of some 14,000 miles that could take up to 6 months by sailing ship. But in 1837, the first year of Victoria's reign, the East India Company employed a retired naval officer to find a faster route. Thomas Waghorn was typical of the Victorians who would expand the British Empire. Part adventurer, part visionary, part man of business. He proposed a shortcut to India, across Egypt and down the Red Sea. Most people thought he was mad. The overland journey across Egypt was plagued by bandits, and the Red Sea was prone to sudden storms. That made it hazardous for large sailing ships. But Britain had pioneered the age of steam, and Waghorn gambled that steamships could operate on the Red Sea without fear of wind or current. As a coaling station, he used the port of Aden, the first colony acquired in Victoria's reign. Soon, regular services were plying the Red Sea between Aden and Suez. More traditional methods were employed to smooth the journey across Egypt: camels, carriages, and hefty bribes to buy off the bandits. Before long, Waghorn was running a thriving business. But his shortcut to the Orient would stir up unexpected trouble in India. The long sea voyage around the Cape had deterred many English women from joining their menfolk in the Far East. But Waghorn's shortcut made the passage to India much easier for them. In addition to the wives came thousands of young women who hoped to attract one of the company's eligible bachelors. These women were to have a dramatic effect on the way of life enjoyed by the men who ran India.
With the coming of the women, there was increasing tendency to establish separate enclaves for Europeans, known as cantonments, which were usually on the outskirts of cities. And in these places, the Europeans were able to live in their own houses. They would socialize together. They wouldn't even go into the town to do their shopping. They had their own cantonment shops, so that they never had to go to the native bazaar. So they were completely enclosed. And in this situation, the European women had really very little contact with the outside world. Their main contact with the Indians was with servants, and these were people whom they commanded as inferiors. They learnt some basic Hindi words, which were often the most insulting forms of address to people. But they did this because this was the way you addressed your servants.
For another thing, of course, there was the sexual aspect of it. They didn't want their menfolk to be associated with Indian women, understandably so, really. But that meant that the gulf was driven through the relationship between Britons and Indians.
The amusingly playful Bibi was pushed into the shadows, slowly, but not entirely, receding. Now, instead of spending his off-duty hours in the Bibi Gar or with his men in the native quarters, the company officer was expected to retire to his bungalow and the bosom of his English family. It was a bosom that often quivered with righteous indignation at what was glimpsed of the world beyond the European compound. The daughter of an English merchant in Lucknow complained bitterly.
The streets are never known to be swept, and flies abound in such numbers that sometimes the shops can only be opened at night. Besides which, the place is infested with monkeys that unscrupulously walk off with all they can lay their hands upon.
Such women were scandalized by tales of the pleasures sampled by the native rulers in the privacy of their royal palaces, and by those more widely available in the natch houses of the native quarters. It was not only English women who demanded change. The same steamships from England brought out missionaries who were determined to make India not only more civilized, but more Christian.
The missionaries who came were very intolerant of Indian religions, particularly Hinduism, which they saw as a religion of superstition, of dirt and squalor, but also of idol worship.
We must unite to condemn the barbarous and obscene rites of Hindu superstition.
The chairman of the East India Company, himself a fervent evangelist, suggested that the company might do more in India than just make money.
We might diffuse among their inhabitants, long sunk in darkness, vice, misery, the light and benign influence of the truth.
There were obviously some practices carried on in India which were, by any standards, reprehensible.
The most disturbing of these practices was the Hindu tradition of sati, burning a widow alive on her dead husband's funeral pyre, ritually prepared by the priest with water, milk, and honey. When a delegation of Indian notables protested that sati was a time-honored custom of their people, General Sir Charles Napier spoke for many of his countrymen.
My people too have a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them.
We can justify the British attempts to root out these practices, but I don't think we can justify the way that they were made into symbols of Indian degeneracy.
There were too many young men in a hurry in India. They come out to Britain, from Britain, with the best of intentions, believing that they had come to India, were about to remake the country, had come as civilizers. And at the same time, many of them were quite fervent evangelical Christians. They were contemptuous of Indian beliefs, openly ridiculed Indian religions and customs, and behaved in a way which suggested to a lot of Indians that the momentum of change was quickening and that it was unstoppable.
some Indians decided to make a stand. They would fight and die to defend their religions and culture. One of them was a young Muslim called Azimullah Khan. He would prove to be one of Britain's most deadly enemies. Azimullah's dealings with the British began as a child when he was brought by his mother to a Christian mission in the north of India. Famine was stalking the region, and mother and child were starving. The mission took them in. Azimullah was educated in the mission school where he learned to speak English and French. But he had been born a Muslim, and he resisted all attempts to convert him to Christianity. When he left the mission, he took a job as khitmatgar, or butler, in the home of an English family. He joined a great army of servants who catered to the needs of the British in India. From the relays of punkawallas who fanned the air in the stifling bungalows, to the trusted ayahs who looked after the children, and to the lofty khitmatgars who served at table. Many remained faithful to their British families through a lifetime of service. But others nursed a bitter, even murderous resentment against the sahibs and mem-sahibs whose whims they had to satisfy. Such a man was Azimullah Khan. In the 1850s, Azimullah joined the followers of an Indian nobleman with his own grievances against the British. Nana Sahib was the leader of a once mighty Hindu nation, the Marathas, who had been defeated by the armies of the East India Company. Nana's father had been paid an annual pension by the company to keep his family in princely style and to maintain a small army. But when his father died, the pension died with him. His enraged heir, Nana Sahib, decided to appeal to the directors of the East India Company in London, and the man he chose to represent him was Azimullah Khan. In 1853, Azimullah traveled to Britain, expecting to see the great source of power that had so impressed Muslim writers before him.
It cannot be without the will of that one supreme being that this small island, which seems on the globe like a mole on the body of man, should command the greater part of the world and keep the rest in awe.
But Azimullah was astonished by the smoke and squalor of London. Here was none of the wealth and dignity maintained by the British in India. Instead, he saw the drunks and the whores, the beggars and the street urchins. Whole families trudging to factories and workshops. In the engine room of empire, the smoke and the dirt blinded Azimullah to the power and the wealth. When the East India Company rejected his appeal on behalf of Nana Sahib, Azimullah was indignant.
England will yet regret the manner in which it has used my master.
It seemed an empty threat, but fate would provide him with the opportunity and the weapon. As Azimullah began his return journey, the British rushed headlong into the first major war of Victoria's reign. It was provoked by fears for the security of the overland link to India pioneered by Thomas Waghorn. In the spring of 1854, Russian armies were sweeping through the Balkans and the British public clamored for action.
First of all, people thought, well, the overland route must be protected. The whole of the Middle East was suddenly seen as a defensive barrier. If somehow someone got across the Middle East, they could invade India. And after all, all these statesmen and generals are all learnt in their public schools about Alexander the Great. He'd done it, so why couldn't someone else? What if the Russians try and follow Alexander the Great? The Tsar had 1 million men. The figure was always said, 1 million men, and he could somehow march them to India. What would the Indian people do? Would they support the British, or would they support the invader?
But the government was divided. The Prime Minister wrote to the Queen,
"No doubt it may be very agreeable to humiliate the Emperor of Russia, but it is paying a little too dear for the pleasure to cover Europe with confusion, misery, and blood."
It was a view shared by Victoria's German-born husband, Prince Albert. His opposition to war became widely known, and the public turned on him in fury. Albert wrote to his brother,
"The public has graciously selected me as its scapegoat to answer for its not yet having come to war."
The English aristocracy had never accepted the prince as one of their own. They sneered at his dress, the open-necked collar and the thigh-length boots he wore to go hunting. Not the English style at all. A letter to the Times wryly speculated on the reasons he was disliked by the upper classes.
"He does not gamble, does not use offensive language, and does not keep an opera dancer."
The Queen suggested another.
"It is that unbounded dislike in England of foreigners, which breaks out continually and is very painful."
A damaging rumor was circulated that Albert was secretly in the pay of the Russians.
Albert did not want war. He felt that whatever was going to happen could be settled peacefully. And when he tried to settle it peacefully, when he tried to get the nations to think in terms of a conference to end the war, he found that people saw him as pro-Russian. And at one point there was a rumor spreading about London that Albert had been arrested as a spy, and thousands of people went to the Tower of London to stare up and see where Albert was, peering out of a window, perhaps, a barred window in the tower. Of course, he wasn't there. This was nonsense. But it gives you an idea of how Albert was thought of at that time.
From somewhat more comfortable quarters in the royal palace of Windsor, the prince wrote to friends in Germany.
"We might fancy we are living in a madhouse. The stupidest trash is babbled to the public, so stupid you would not give it to the pigs to litter in."
The madness against Albert passed, but not the fever for war. In March 1854, a British fleet sailed for the Black Sea with 30,000 troops. They joined French and Turkish forces in an attack on the Russian naval base of Sebastopol in the Crimea. With the outbreak of hostilities, Albert knew where his duty lay. He embarked for France to review the troops assembled for dispatch to the Crimea and cement the shaky alliance with the French Emperor. Charles Dickens was on vacation in France when he saw the two men riding past at the head of a troop of cavalry. Albert's diplomacy was a great success. Dickens saw bonfires lit all along the coast to celebrate the alliance between Britain and France. Dickens made his own contribution by lighting 120 candles in the window of his rented cottage on the cliffs above the English Channel. But in the Crimea, there was little to celebrate. It had been 40 years since the British Army had fought a major war. It was ill-prepared and worse led.
The army that went to the Crimea hadn't been in action in any meaningful way since the Battle of Waterloo 40 years before, but it was exactly the same. The weaponry, the training, the systems, everything was exactly the same as it had been during the Napoleonic Wars. The world had moved on since then, but the army hadn't. And Lord Raglan, who was the commander of the Victorian army, had no military experience. He'd never commanded as much as a platoon. So they went out there, and practically everything that could go wrong went wrong.
A British officer described the conditions.
The men stand day and night in trenches full of water, holding their muskets in their cramped and half-frozen hands, the rain soaking the only clothes they have in the world, which once wet will remain damp forever in this climate.
The conditions of the troops was absolutely awful. That they had virtually no supplies, no medical backup at all. They were starving. They were running with lice. They had no tents. They lived in waterlogged trenches. It was a small, ghastly pre-run, if you like, of the Great War.
Britain's allies were better equipped and better nourished. A dragoon in the French army reported that the British were so desperate they would exchange their boots for something to eat.
We give them what we can. It is pitiful to see such superb men asking permission to gorge themselves on the dregs in our mess tins.
Dysentery and cholera swept the ranks, and disease was followed by fatal blunders on the field of battle. The Crimea witnessed the most memorable single fiasco in British military history, the charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade was the finest cavalry force in Europe, but it was commanded by George Brudenell, Earl of Cardigan, who treated war as just another aristocratic hobby like fox hunting. He was sent a written order to recover some British cannon that had been seized by the Russians to his right.
Cardigan read this and looked around, and the only guns he could see were the Russian guns directly to his front and other Russian guns on either flank. So, being as he was a rather impetuous officer and not one endowed with brains, he decided to attack. His wonderful last line as he drew his sword was, "Here go the last of the Brudenells," because he was in no doubt that if they went into that valley, most of them weren't coming out. And it was a total shambles.
Cardigan led the Light Brigade into the wrong valley, a valley lined on three sides with Russian artillery. The carnage was described by his men in flashes of horrific detail.
We advanced at a gallop amid a fearful fire from front, left and right of grape, shell and canister. Horses and men fell thick and fast.
Bleeding objects in one's path. Sometimes a man, sometimes a horse.
They were cut to pieces. They did actually reach the Russian guns and killed the Russian gunners. And all around, on the slopes, people were watching, aghast, with their hands over their eyes.
Of the 600 men who charged into the Valley of Death, barely half rode back alive. 30,000 troops had been sent to the Crimea. Within a year, 2/3 were dead or wounded. For the first time in the history of conflict, the suffering of the men and the failings of the generals were described in graphic detail to the public at home. For the Crimea introduced the world's first war correspondent, William Russell, of the London Times.
The noblest army ever sent from these shores has been sacrificed to the grossest mismanagement. Incompetence, lethargy and stupidity reign, revel and riot in the camp before Sebastopol and in the hospitals of Scutari.
Among the millions who read Russell's dispatches was the embittered Indian envoy Azimullah Khan. As a result, he decided to make a detour on his way back to India to see for himself what was happening to the British Army in the Crimea. He toured the hospitals where a woman called Florence Nightingale was fighting to save the lives of the British wounded and bring some order to the chaos. Even in the slums of London, Azimullah had never seen the British brought so low. It reinforced his belief that they were far from invincible. On his return to India, Azimullah faced an uncomfortable meeting with Nana Sahib. He had failed to win back the prince's titles and pensions, and he had spent lavishly of his master's funds. But Azimullah had rehearsed an argument that he hoped would save him from Nana Sahib's displeasure. The British were finished, he claimed. All they needed was a final push, and then the disinherited ruler could take all that was due to him, and more. He could exact a savage revenge for all the humiliations heaped upon him by the East India Company. Over the next few months, Azimullah's agents joined other dissident Indians in a campaign of rumor and subversion. They fanned the smoldering resentment aroused by the evangelists who appeared to threaten the sacred beliefs of Hindu and Muslim alike. They whispered that the British had been defeated in the Crimea and that a Russian army was now advancing on India. None of this was true. It was the Russians who had been defeated. But the rumor was widely believed. The British agents of the East India Company were puzzled and alarmed. As tensions rose, they tried to keep their fears from their families. But their only security rested in the native troops of the East India Company. Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, Hindus, and Muslims. By the 1850s, their ranks had swollen to over 260,000. More than 10 times the number of British soldiers stationed in India, and more than twice the size of the entire British army around the world. Their loyalty was vital if the British were to remain in India, and in the wake of the Crimean War, the company made a seemingly trivial decision that would prove disastrous. British instructors began to train their Indian troops to use a new rifle, the Lee Enfield, with a cartridge that was greased with animal fat. A rumor spread that the grease was made from a mixture of beef and pork, one forbidden to Hindus, the other to Muslims. It triggered a revolt known to the British as the Indian Mutiny, and to the Indians as the First War of Independence.
The immediate reason for the revolt was the belief amongst many of the Indian soldiers that they were being polluted deliberately by the British with the cartridges which had either beef or pork fat. However, once it actually started, a whole range of grievances came to the fore, which were connected with the things that the British had been doing in the preceding 30 years.
The revolt began in the garrison town of Meerut in the far north. when 90 troopers refused to handle the new cartridges. The soldiers were publicly stripped of their uniforms and sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The next day was a Sunday, May the 10th, 1857. As the British settled down after the church service, their slumbers were disturbed by the sound of gunfire. Native troops had stormed the prison and released their 90 comrades. Then, joined by a mob from the bazaar, they charged into the British quarter. Barracks and bungalows were torched. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. The Great Mutiny had begun. At first it was confined to one area in the north. The isolated British garrisons throughout India held their breath to see if the mutiny would spread. So too did Nana Sahib. Despite the urgings of Azimullah Khan and others, he held back until he knew how the British would react. Just a few miles from his palace was the garrison town of Kanpur, a magnet for many of the young women who had left Britain in search of a husband. One of them had been lent a piano by Nana Sahib, who was friendly with several of the British families in the garrison. Sincerely or not, Nana Sahib assured them that he would protect British women and children with his personal army if local Indian troops joined the mutiny. Throughout May, the peace held, and the British did their best to continue as usual. It was the calm before the storm. On June 4th, 1857, the Indian troops attacked their British officers and set fire to their quarters. The entire European community of 1,000 men, women, and children fled to a half-built barrack block on the edge of the city, hastily fortified against attack. 2 days later, Nana Sahib joined the rebels with his own army and took personal command of the siege. The makeshift fortress was raked by cannon and musket fire. Azimullah mockingly called it Fort Despair. On June 10th, news of the revolt reached Britain, and 30,000 troops were sent to deal with the crisis. But it would take several months for the slow-moving troop ships to reach India. Meanwhile, at Kanpur and nearby Lucknow, the beleaguered British garrisons held out week after week under constant bombardment.
Several hundred women were besieged within makeshift defenses. Gradually whittled away, several of them having babies as went along, disease coming in, of course, lack of food. It was the most horrific experience.
One of the women, 18-year-old Amelia Horn, described the horrors in detail.
Every shot that struck the barracks was followed by heart-rending shrieks of women and children who were either killed outright by the projectiles or crushed to death by falling beams, masonry and splinters. Sometimes a whole family would be found lying dead, side by side.
The only source of water was a well swept by sniper fire.
On one occasion, we were obliged to drink some water mixed with human blood from the wounds of a native nurse or ayah, who, while standing nearby, had both her legs carried away by the bursting of a shell.
On June 12th, the hospital block was set alight by shell fire, burning many of the wounded to death and destroying all the remaining medical supplies.
No relief whatever could now be offered to the sick and wounded. There was nothing now to soothe their dying moments. The heat affected their wounds, and the flies settled on them and drove them crazy. It was now that our skirts were in demand. We tore every vestige to supply bandages for the wounded.
On the 25th of June 1857, Nana Sahib offered a deal. If the British would move out, he guaranteed safe conduct for the survivors to leave Kanpur by boat down the river Ganges. They had no choice but to accept. The point of departure was a Hindu temple where the faithful took their ritual baths. A fleet of boats had been assembled with native crews to punt the survivors to safety. Thatched awnings protected them from the heat of the sun. But as the Europeans climbed aboard, the boatmen leapt ashore, scattering burning embers from their cooking stoves. Hundreds of native troops emerged from hiding and fired volley after volley into the burning boats. Mounted troopers rode into the water, slashing down with their sabers. Over 500 men, women, and children died in the massacre of Kanpur. Just 4 men escaped downriver to tell the tale. About 120 women and children who had survived the slaughter were rounded up on the riverbank. The captives were herded into a building where the Indian mistress of a British officer had once lived, known as a bibi gar. But help was finally on the way. A scratch force of 1,000 Scottish Highlanders, a few English Fusiliers, and some loyal Sikhs had been sent from other parts of India. They marched down the Grand Trunk Road in the full heat of the Indian summer. Nana Sahib set out to confront them at the head of 5,000 rebels. The new rifles played a key role, picking the rebels off at long range. The result was a victory for the British. The survivors fled back to the city to warn their supporters.
The British are coming like mad beasts, caring for neither cannon nor musketry.
At the bibi gar, the number of captives had risen to 180 women and children, crowded into the 3 rooms and courtyard of the house. They included the 2 young friends who, barely 5 weeks before, had been playing chamber music on Nana Sahib's piano. Many of the prisoners were wounded, dying of cholera and other infections, or broken by heat and despair. A few recorded their experiences on scraps of paper, or scratched them on the walls with charcoal and broken bits of pottery. They could hear the rumble of guns as the relief force neared the city. But the faces that appeared at the windows were not those of British soldiers. The mutineers fired 2 volleys into the crowded rooms, but sickened by the slaughter, they refused to fire again. 4 butchers were recruited from the town. It was a little before sunset when they entered the bibi gar. They emerged an hour later. At the sight of them, the remaining onlookers fled into the darkness. In the morning, a party of volunteers arrived to clear the bodies. They dragged them out of the building, stripped them of their blood-soaked clothing, and threw them down a nearby well. Eyewitnesses reported that several women and children were still alive, but they were thrown in along with the mutilated corpses.
I think the attacks on women can be explained in terms of a belief that the honour of a particular group was reposed in the women, and often when a group was conquered in war, women were attacked, raped, taken away into slavery and so on. This was part of humiliating an enemy.
The streets of Kanpur were deserted as the relief force entered the city. Thousands had fled before them. Loyalists directed the advance guard to the Bibigar. The first to open the door was a young officer of the 78th Highlanders. He reported that the scene he saw was the most awful that the eye could behold. He was wrong. A few moments later, he found the well. The news reached Britain a few weeks later.
When the details of the mutiny begin to appear in the British press in the summer of 1857, there is horror and outrage. Stories were coming back of the murder of European women and children, often in the most hideous circumstances. And the sort of respect which the Victorians had for women and for children, this was outraged.
Women at that time in Great Britain had been elevated to a ridiculous pedestal of sanctity and virtue, which made them on a different plane from men, and meant that the attack on them by people of another race was not only sexually wicked, but was actually religiously wicked too. And so the stories that came out of Kanpur, for the women to be taken away into a small house and quite deliberately and obscenely slaughtered, affected the English public very, very greatly.
Victoria wrote to the wife of the Governor-General in Calcutta.
Our thoughts are almost solely occupied with India. My heart bleeds for the horrors that have been committed by people once so gentle on my poor countrywomen and innocent little children. It haunts me day and night.
The massacres at Kanpur were not only the worst atrocity the British could imagine. They were regarded by the men who had conquered India as the most shameful reproach. They had failed their women and children. The darkness of the well at the Bibigar closed over them all.
Atrocities, well, that was actually war. And when you have war, there are bound to be some excesses. On both sides, yes. Well, it started off with a bunch of people, soldiers, who had a simmering resentment against the British who were lording it over them. So when they got the chance to get back at them, they were quite excessive. But thereafter, the retributions